So, good evening. I'm going to be talking about our new exhibition that's just opened, Uncommon People, Folk Culture in Wessex. So I'll just share my screen with you. I'm David Dawson. I'm director of the museum, and I hope you're going to enjoy this. Some absolutely fitting things that we have in the exhibition. So it's only just opened, and we've had some really great reaction so far, which will be a real pleasure to share with you. So we start with I guess, with the title of Uncommon People, Folk Culture in Wessex. And the obvious question is, what on earth do we mean by folk culture? Um, there's one definition of folk art, which is sort of a helpful starting point, which is art created by people who haven't done formal art training. And that sort of extends beyond that into folk culture, which is defined in the exhibition as being created by and for people and their communities. And it includes things like festivals, songs, stories, and art, which all create part of this rich living culture. And folk celebrations in Britain include the obvious things like Bonfire Night, as well as Diwali or Oak Apple Day. But of course, it covers also everyday celebrations like birthdays and things like that. There's a equally part of the way we celebrate them, equally part of folk culture. And then the common, uncommon people is because in the past, commoner was used by those in power to describe those who are actually doing all the hard work. And there you've got that dichotomy between formal art and folk art. And that's why the term common, uncommon people has been chosen, as well as obviously the pulp song as well. And for a change, that means that what we've done in the exhibition, is to explore a very different story to the one that we're often telling in museums, a very straightforward, ordinary culture, but full of the most amazing objects. Now, the exhibition has been developed by our Wessex Museums Partnership. As you see, Dorset, Swindon, Poole, and Salisbury, all of us working together. And the real joy has been finding objects and discovering objects in our collections, many of which have just never been on display, and being able to showcase them in this exhibition. So there's a whole series of themes in the exhibition, but just to be slightly contrary, what I've done is actually drawn out my own themes from the exhibition, and I'll be talking about some of the objects and some of their stories. But I'm going to start with some of the songs and some of the traditions, the stories, which I think are so important. And one of the key features of the exhibition is this amazing song map. And as you can see, it's a map of Wiltshire and Dorset, our Wessex area. And each map tile that you see either reflects a local story, a tradition, or as you can see, it also has the museums. And when you visit the exhibition, you can play a number of these stories using sort of a sound thingy where you press a button. But also, if you go onto our website, you can actually do this online and play those stories sitting in the comfort of your own home, which is something I heartily recommend. Some absolutely amazing things that have been recorded. And amongst the many stories, I've just picked up two. Being in Devizes, of course, we have to have the Moonrakers, which I fear I have little need to explain. And the background to this, of course, is smuggling and the idea of the yokels in Wiltshire being stupid. And they were smuggling kegs of brandy and hid them in the crammer. At least that's the way the story goes, to keep them safe from the excise men. And then the smugglers came back at night using rakes to try and to locate the barrels and to load them up again. And they got raided by the excise men. And the story that the yokels used was to say that they thought that the moon reflection in the crammer was cheese, and they were trying to find the cheese. Nothing to do with the brandy, of course. But there's many other stories as well. The other one I wanted to pick up was one actually from Dorset, where there's the Binkham Bumps, the singing barrows. And there, the local story is that at midnight, at May Day, Midsummer, and Halloween, when the worlds of the past and the future and the underworld and so on, when they come close together, that at midnight you could hear the noise of music and singing coming from the barrows, and that this was the little people who were said to carry treasure. And a farm labourer named Thomas heard about the treasure and decided that he wanted to come and steal it. Now, the little people obviously didn't want that to happen. They captured him and held him down until the daylight came, and he was nowhere near the treasure. But I find this really a fascinating story because, of course, as you see in the illustrations, one of the things that it does is it's a reminder of the tradition that yes, there were people buried in those barrows, and sometimes yes, there was treasure, but also it was somewhere that you didn't go. It didn't belong to this world, and that you shouldn't go and disturb the barrows. That was a place for the little people. It was another world that you shouldn't touch. And what that suggests is that you've got a continuity of oral tradition going back anything up to 3,500, possibly even 4,000 years ago. And this also reminds me that UNESCO, you may have come across the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. You've probably heard of it in terms of the World Heritage Sites, particularly locally, of course, Stonehenge and Avebury. But it has another designation called Intangible Heritage. And that's celebrating those things that can't be written down, that the stories, the music, the traditions, the ceremonies of people across the world, they're recognised in the Register of Intangible Cultural Heritage. And the UK over the last couple of years is now taking steps to create a register like those that exist in many other countries. But we've got this idea that oral traditions are really only a few hundred years old and they all change and can't be relied upon. But actually sometimes at the heart of them, there are stories that really do survive for generations. And the song map also helps to highlight some calendar celebrations. And just the first one I find absolutely fascinating is the story of the Dorset Oozer. And you see here a character, a Morris dancer, dressed with carrying the mask of the Dorset Oozer. A fantastic photo of him propped, leaning here against the wall of what I assume is a pub. Perish the thought. And at May Day in Cerne Abbas, as of the Cerne Abbas giant, the Wessex Morris celebrate May Day, dancing up by the giant, led by the Dorset Oozer. And this is a really old tradition, and the mask is not, unfortunately, the real mask, or the one that had served for generations, has disappeared, but has been recreated both here and there's an example in the Dorset Museum. And then moving on in the year, I've already mentioned May Day, but in Wiltshire we have the amazing tradition of the Wishford Oak Apple Day. And you see here a coronation mug for Queen Elizabeth II, 1953. And you see here commemorating the Wishford rites, 1603 to 1953. So that anniversary. And unity is strength. This is an amazing tradition, which started in 1603 when there was a charter which formalised the rights of people of Great Wishford to collect wood from the Royal Forest of Grovelly Wood. And you see here people going out to collect wood from Grovelly Wood. And the way that people were able to claim this right was by singing and proclaiming grovelly, 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 and marching in procession to Salisbury Cathedral. And this tradition carrying on here, you see, with dancing and apple leaves. And the procession still engages people of all ages, including these youngsters, and you see them there with the oak leaves, and they process into the cathedral, grovelly, 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 and all grovelly. Unity is strength. Wonderful statement there. And these rites, though, were really important to people, of course, because people needed firewood. So the ability to go and collect firewood, absolutely vital. And the rights, though, were revoked by the Earl of Pembroke in the early 19th century, and this led to widespread protests. And a young woman called Grace Reed was actually put in prison for her role in the peaceful protest. But later, this tradition has become combined with Oak Apple Day on the 29th of May. And Oak Apple Day was created or celebrates the restoration of Charles II, and is the day on which he hid at Boscobel Oak when he was fleeing country after the Battle of Worcester, before he was restored to the throne. And it's quite interesting the way that sometimes these traditions do get combined in different ways. And then, of course, we have Midsummer's Day at Stonehenge, which, of course, we all know about. And one of the joys in the exhibition is a film we have created by Create Studios from Swindon, who are an amazing group. They undertake commercial media work, but the way that they operate is by working with young people who either are just about to or have just finished their training at university or college, work together on projects, and that's giving them the CV and the experience and the contacts to then go and work in the real world. So really preparing people for their first jobs in the media industry. And there's a wonderful film that you can see in the museum, but also, again, if you go to the website, and you'll see a link to films for each of the main celebrations of the year, developed by Create Studios. Absolutely fascinating watches. But Stonehenge isn't the only place where Midsummer's Day is celebrated. You probably all know of the Salisbury giant, who is in Salisbury Museum. And the giant was made by the Tailors Guild in the 15th century for the parades, which took place on Midsummer's Day, which then was the 24th of June. The Hobnob, who's the character, the horse and rider, was developed later. That's Hobnob means hit or miss, which is fascinating, and is first mentioned in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. So again, that too has a very long tradition. But I find it fascinating that is a way of celebrating Midsummer's Day. And then, of course, we have ceremonies and traditions that have been developed from other countries, whether that's something as sort of mainstream, if you like, as the use of Christmas trees, which of course came from Germany in the 19th century, inspired by Prince Albert, or Diwali, the Festival of Lights that takes place in Poole. And you see here the film by Create Studios follows a family in Poole who were celebrating the Diwali festival at home. And then to round off the year, well, slightly more than round off the year, at Twelfth Night we have wassailing, a set of ceremonies to promote a good crop of apples in the year ahead, where people sing to trees, pour cider on the roots, put tie wishes to the branches of the tree, and bang pots and pans to ward off evil spirits. So a wonderful tradition. It's great fun. So these are some of the celebrations that mark the year. But then we have lots of amazing objects in the museum. and which is real, I use the word today, of eclectic mix. And they've been chosen to really reflect that depth of folk culture. And many of you will be familiar with these, with canalware, enamel pots and pans, which have been brightly painted and decorated. The motifs are often roses, but also castles, and sometimes sort of idyllic landscapes. And you can suggest that these are sort of customizing of everyday things. These ones were used, came from boats that were sailing on the North Wiltshire Canal and from the collections of Swindon Museum. But of course, these were not for use. These were for display and for showing off. That idea of customization follows through in many ways today. We have these amazing skateboards, a couple of them customized by Ricky also, again from Swindon, who has trained literally hundreds of youngsters in how to skateboard and giving them good exercise out in the open air away from their screens, which is always a good thing. And then for centuries, people have used and reused scraps of materials to make new objects. Many of you will be familiar with quilts, and this is an amazing one from the collections of Salisbury Museum. So quilts, but also rag rugs. And often those scraps have been carefully chosen to include the stories of the people who wore those clothes that have now been reused. This quilt was made by, almost certainly made by Harriet Dowdall in the mid 1800s, say about the 1850s or perhaps 1860s. But amongst the variety of fabrics, it includes cotton fabrics dating from around 1830. So these would be parts of dresses that were 20, 30, 40 years old when then incorporated into the quilt. And the quilt was used by four different generations of her family before it was given to the museum, I think in the 1920s. But it's not only quilts where this technique has been used. This is a Verwood pottery flask with lugs. Perhaps you can see the sort of the serrations on the top. Those have got holes in them, which means that you can thread leather thongs through them to carry it. This is an earthenware pottery flask, which means that water in it will sort of slowly percolate through the earthenware, and then on the outside will then evaporate. And that means it keeps the contents of the flask cool. But this one has been highly decorated by choosing fragments of pottery. And it's fascinating talking to Julian Richards at the launch of our exhibition, because he took great delight in looking at all the different bits of pot, and he was able to sort of say where many of them came from. And what he suggested was that these pieces of pot were found came from someone's garden, because there's such a variety here. That it's not just a single tea service that's been dropped. These have come from a wide range of different places. So an absolutely really colourful flask here. The original of these, this type of flask, is known as a Dorset owl, and this technique of decorating with pottery sherds is apparently very well known and is called broody, though I've never heard of that. And then this is probably my second favourite object in the collection, and this is a sweetheart cushion. So made and given to a lady, perhaps a wife or a girlfriend, during the First World War. And at the centre you can see the badge of the Wiltshire Regiment, and at the back you can see it says "Think of me," and sort of little verse. Now, when I saw this, I had assumed that they were made by women, as a gift for the men. And I couldn't quite work out what the point of that was. But of course, I'm completely wrong. These were made by men, often when they were recovering from injuries. And there were actually kits that they would be issued with in hospital. And what these kits would, what they were doing was they were then have something to do, something to keep their hands busy, something to keep their minds busy while they were recuperating. And that's why they often include regimental badges, because these are the sorts of things that people had to hand and would be a wonderful gift for a loved one at home. This one was given to us about 10 years ago and came from Roud, so it has very much has local connections. And that same aspect of keeping busy, you see in a very different way for sailors. So this is a ship in a bottle from the collections of Poole Museum, and was made by a chap called Arthur Bradbury, and it shows the Poole-based merchant ship called Ariel. And you can see how what an amazing piece of skill this is to be able to create these models. The masts, of course, were flat when the ship was put in. Then the mast had to be erected, and so the rigging put in place using sort of long pair of tweezers, sort of thing. So real work of skill to create these, and these were often again created by sailors who had plenty of time on their hands. Though probably not in a force 9 gale. But as well, they were also created by other prisoners of war. This is one again from Poole, and shows a very different type of boat, and you see the landscape beyond. This one was created again by someone with plenty of time on their hands. This was created by an Italian prisoner of war who was held in Poole during the First World War. And then we have some amazing things made from cigarette packs. So here's this dog, as you can see, is made from players' cigarette packets. And it's just such a work of art. I have no idea how on earth they had this chap had the patience to make this, and let alone how they survived. Apparently, this was a really popular hobby in the 1930s, but very few of these survive because they are so fragile. You can imagine how easy it would be to crush one of these. And then as well, we have the same cigarette pack made into this amazing sort of star-shaped pattern and framed for display. Really absolutely amazing. Though perhaps not quite so good for the breathing and the lungs, so not quite so good for the health. But there are many other crafts, of course, as well. And we here we have a corn dolly, which is interestingly I hadn't realised, but corn dollies were made from the last sheaf of corn to be cut at harvest. They're first mentioned in the UK in the 1500s and originally called harvest tokens or trophies, which sort of gives a much better idea of what they were used for, what the idea was. And there are often very local designs and customs about how these were made and used and the designs. And these were thought to provide a home for the spirit of the corn until the next summer and the next harvest, which is absolutely fascinating. You've got these sort of pagan undertones rolling through some of these objects. And similarly, these are baskets called nanglos, who were intrigued. These were made by a group of Nepali ladies who have a craft group in Tidworth, and they were fascinated by the corn dollies. And they talked about, in their own tradition, they make these nanglo baskets. Originally, these were used for winnowing rice. Well, they still are, because you can you spread the rice and you flick them up in the air, and the husks blow away. But they have also become used for serving, sort of holding items used in ceremonies or for serving food. And you see here some foods, you see some marigolds used in flowers used in weddings during Diwali. And on the left-hand side, you can see some banknotes. But I hasten to add, these aren't real ones because this would be a way of presenting money to the happy couple at a wedding. So again, the traditional basket, then having these other uses in ceremonies. And here you have a child's shoe. This is quite small. It's probably I imagine what say a shoe belonged to a 4 or 5 year old. And I have to look very carefully at my notes here. These are apotropaic, which means that these are ways of averting evil. And the idea here is that you place something in where somebody can an evil spirit can enter your house. So that might be through a doorway, through a window, or the chimney. And again, you have a bit of an echo here with Christmas, where of course that's the reason Santa Claus comes down the chimney. That's also a route for where evil could come in. But the shoe is there to ward off the evil spirits, though probably not Santa Claus. And shoes were particularly favoured because they were thought to be imbued with the spirit of the wearer. Now, I'm sure you know that if you've ever put on someone else's shoes by mistake, you know they just don't feel right because the shoes adapt to the shape of your foot. So they sort of encompass your personality. So they're very powerful in warding off evil. And then similarly, you have witches' bottles. This is what's called a Bellarmine jug. Allegedly, the rather fearsome-looking mask is a portrait of Cardinal Bellarmine, who was a cardinal in Germany, in the Rhineland, where this type of jug was first made. But it became a standard thing, and these sort of jugs were turned out by the hundreds, by the thousands, particularly in Fulham, for example. And they were often used for holding beer or wine or something like that. But also they were used in the same way to ward off evil. And they might be filled with things like, with urine, which again was very powerful magic substance. And they've also been found with things like pins in them, again, to ward off evil. And again, in the exhibition, we have this fascinating dowsing stick. And it reminds me of a project I was involved with many, many, many years ago at Durham Cathedral, where we used geophysics techniques, resistivity, to try and work out where the Saxon cathedral had been before the Normans knocked it down and started again. And we compared the results of dowsing and of the resistivity survey. And surprisingly, the two were not far off. They both indicated the same general area of the cloisters where the Saxon cathedral may have been. Never tested by excavation, I have to add. And following that theme of sort of magic, this again is an object we've had in our collections for a long time and is really weird. So on the this is a disc of silver. It's about that big, so it's about 2 inches across, 1.5 inches across, and it's inscribed Alpha et Omega, and on the and Monday, reference to the moon, and on the back you've got that square of numbers, and each row and each column adds up to the same number. And something I learned through this project, through the exhibition, was that this is the seal of Jupiter, and it's taken from a book called Clavis of Solomon, published in 1793, which is sort of is all about magical spells and things like that. So absolutely fascinating to know there's that depth of story behind it. But to bring things up to date a bit more, then you also have interventions, so not just magic, but also medical interventions. And we all remember what COVID was like and lockdown, which is just 5 years ago now. Seems like yesterday. And this was knocked together by someone living in Swindon, which was a ball game of being the first to be vaccinated. And you can see that this has been printed out and mounted on card. And the designer then printed out did some 3D printing of the game pieces as well. And the race was to get to the vaccination centre and be vaccinated and be safe from COVID, which is great fun. But COVID also brought out sort of all sorts of other traditions and so on, which is these are two beach pebbles which were painted, expressing the sort of thanks to key workers. And on the left-hand side, this is a photo taken just around the corner from me, because I took it, of a snake of painted pebbles that was placed on Quakers Walk in Devizes. And you can see how long this was. And I felt rather guilty about this, but I knew that we had to collect some of these stones for our collections, because it was something that really was so powerful at the time. But I did sort of contact people and say, I'm going to take some of these. Is that okay? And I did make sure we waited until the first frosts were due, and the stones would not have lasted through the frost. Those that I only took a small sample, and those that were left behind did deteriorate very, very rapidly. So I am reassured that the paint would have disappeared anyhow. And all sorts of other interesting things. So this is a collection of a lady called Pam Whittle, and you see her photo there on the right-hand side. She is the taller lady on the right, and she was a Speedway fan of the Poole Pirates Speedway team. And she's standing in front of a coach which was taking all the supporters up to London to watch the Speedway final. And you see there her favourite riders, her rattle, and her hat filled with badges, and sort of reminds us of how fascinating about sports fans. And then music is obviously really important. So this is an object we had on display for many years, and it was wonderful to bring it out again. This is a cello made around about 1800 by the village blacksmith at Milton Lilbourne, so in the Vale of Pewsey. The amazing thing about this is that the body of the cello is made of iron, whereas the fret and the tuning pegs are all made of wood. So why on earth would you make a cello out of iron? And the answer, of course, is that musical instruments made of the finest wood were incredibly expensive, whereas the village blacksmith could knock up something made of iron themselves. So it made the musical instrument affordable. And this is part of a tradition of church bands. And those of you who like Thomas Hardy, like me, will remember Thomas Hardy talking about the Mellstock Choir in his book Under the Greenwood Tree. And he talks about how the choir was in church on Sundays to play the music for hymns, but they'd often have rather sore heads because they'd been up all night playing at a village dance. And Hardy talked about how the vicar disapproved of this and introduced an organ to bring respectability back into the church and destroying that long tradition of people enjoying themselves with music and dancing. This, and to emphasize this, the cello was donated to our museum in 1916 by the vicar's daughter, and it was last used in 1970 to celebrate the 700th anniversary of the church, which I think is wonderful. And following along with weird musical instruments, this is a xylophone made of different files and chisels. Um, this is made by someone who worked in the GWR works in Swindon, which is just bizarre. And this is called a humstrum. This, as you can see, works a bit like a violin, but the sounding board is a tin can. But this has a fascinating past because this belonged to a chap called Francis William Gilpin. In 1893, he established Ye Olde English Pasty Times, um, which was to celebrate folk songs and nostalgia. And it was used by him to play Summer is a Comin' In, which is 13th century song, which was sung in, if you like, in a Wessex dialect, and is often sung on May Day. But that tradition of musical instruments and how they're made is echoed by this Indian instrument from the collection of the Swindon Museum, and this is used to celebrate Diwali, bringing back a very different tradition. And then we have to finish by my all-time favourite object, which is this, which is actually I have to say in the exhibition, which is this, which is a seed picture. So it's a picture made entirely of seeds. It almost certainly represents Darby and Joan, two characters in a poem called The Joys of Love Never Forgotten, written in 1735. Now, I'd always heard of Darby and Joan clubs, and I had I knew what they were, but I had no idea where the name comes from. But it comes from this poem of 1735. And this is made of 20 different seeds, including daisy, stinging nettle, poppy, and pumpkin. Amazing story. So, um, what I've done is just try to highlight some of the main parts of the exhibition, and these are just some of the objects. We've got well over 100 objects in the exhibition, complete eclectic mix, and I challenge you to find your favourite. So with that, I'll draw my talk to a close, and I'm very happy to attempt to try and answer any questions you may have. So if you would like to use the Q&A button, then you can ask any questions if you like. Just a slight warning that it may take a little while for the questions to come through. So if I'm a little hesitant, that may be why. And I've just seen someone who joined the talk was joining us from sunny Dorset. It's not quite so sunny now, I have to say. I'll just have a glug of water. Does anyone have any questions? Anything anyone would like to add? No, nothing coming through. Give it another minute. I think I do have one. No, I don't think so. Obviously, I've either failed miserably or you've been absolutely fascinated, one of the two. So with that, thank you very much for coming along. I hope you found that interesting, and do come and see the exhibition. There's some absolutely amazing stuff in it. So thank you very much, and good night, everyone.